Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Houston Ensemble podcast. We have a wonderful episode today with the Vice President of Administration at Rice University, Kevin Kirby. And I'm just going to give you a little bio on Kevin because he's had a really, really interesting career. He's the Vice President for Administration at Rice University. Prior to joining Rice, Dr. Kirby was the Chief Operating Officer for the Columbia University Medical Center, served as Executive Officer for the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the National Institutes of Health, held several management positions with the Army Research Laboratory, served on the staff of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, served as Science Advisor for the Commanding General, Army Forces Command, and started his career conducting research on the low temperature behavior of materials at the Army Materials Technology Lab. There's a lot more. He also went to Syracuse University and MIT. So I'm going to let Kevin talk a little bit more when we get into it. But Kevin, thank you so much for coming today. So I really appreciate it. And for people who don't know, Rice University is my alma mater. And so I like to have people from Rice come on the show. And you know, Kevin was put into the head position for crisis management at Rice during the COVID era. And he also teaches 2 classes, one on leadership and then one on crisis management. Is that correct?
That's right.
So just, you know, from the get-go, leadership is kind of an ambiguous thing. And I want to know from you, teaching that class, when you're teaching them, what do you say are qualities or things that create a good leader? Because obviously right now in the country, don't know how it's looking. What is your advice?
It is widely known that the tobacco and diet industries lobby governments with scientific propaganda for years until proven guilty in court. The artificial treatment of our water is the next corporate deception.
For example, virtually every nation in Europe has rejected the use of artificial fluoride. International studies since the 40s have repeatedly shown that endocrine and neurological effects increase after repeated consumption, even at the levels accepted by U.S. government.
Epic Water Filters is the most thorough industry-grade filtration system that Houston Ensemble has ever used. They reduce heavy metals upwards of 99.5%, such as lead and mercury, bacteria like E. coli, and poisons like chromium, nitrate, and fluoride.
Join us in our journey to living a toxin-free life and get your Epic Water Filter using discount code Houston Ensemble, lowercase, one word. That's Houston Ensemble, lowercase, one word for 20% off your Epic Water Filter.
That's exactly what I don't teach about. So everybody's got their own list. You know, you should be more charismatic, you should be more empathetic, you should be a servant leader. None of them work in every context. And so people who try and emulate really extraordinary people, the people who write the books are the ones who have their own lists. So if you can be more like me, then you too can be successful. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work in every context. And the only thing that really works is when you're incredibly self-aware. And what that does is it turns into confidence that you can have because you know yourself, you know the kinds of situations in which you'll thrive. And confidence turns thought into action, which are when the opportunities present themselves to you, that you can sort of leap into those opportunities. And so I really don't like lists and things like that. So I teach people there's no secret sauce to that. The most important thing when you're in your 20s is to, by the time you exit your 20s, to be incredibly self-aware. And everybody's got a different definition of leadership. And don't distinguish between leaders and leadership. They're 2 different things. One's a person, one's a process. So it takes me a whole semester to get people to understand my point of view about that.
What makes a difference between a person who is nurtured such that they develop that self-awareness versus somebody that just doesn't have it for whatever reason? What is the key difference here, do you think?
It's not hard, but it requires being diligent over a long period of time. It's not something you can go take a course in and all of a sudden you become more self-aware. It takes the ability to get feedback, lots of different ways to get feedback, then to reflect on that feedback, to experiment, and just keep iterating. And if you're an undergrad at Rice, By the time you get to be 30, there's a great ability to be incredibly self-aware, but you have to just keep at it over a long period of time.
So, Kevin, would you say that a lot of, kind of the trope is that people are born leaders or that they're naturally a leader? Do you think that, especially when teaching this to undergrads, that that's actually accurate, or do you think that really anybody can do that?
No, I think it's just the opposite. That, it depends on what statistics you look at, but this is a many tens of billions of dollar industry. Last time I checked, there were 100,000 books on leadership on Amazon. Right. Everyone's got a point of view about it, and there's no sort of agreed upon definition of it. And people want more of it, right? And so we keep creating institutes, training experiences, books, and things seem to be getting worse. So why is that the case? Mm-hmm. Why are we getting worse? If you look at groups that are well studied, like Fortune 500 CEOs, over half of them are narcissists. So should we be teaching you to be a narcissist? Or who are the most charismatic people on the planet? Politicians. I don't think our politicians are serving us particularly well in general. Right. And so we're teaching and preaching all the wrong things to people. And what we really need to do is to get people to understand that self-awareness is the path to becoming a better leader. And we need leaders at all levels, at all different times. Mm-hmm. Most people look at people like the president of Rice, for example. Well, he must be a leader because of his position. Well, not necessarily. And if you ask him how many decisions of great import he made today, he might say 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Right? So this view that leaders are deciding all the time, that they're the most influential people, it's just not reality.
So speaking of the president of Rice, for people who don't know, the former president of Rice was David Lebron, who we did have on the podcast. He was actually, I believe, our 6th ever episode. So that was pretty cool. We're very grateful to him for coming on. But we just got the email the other day that it is now Reginald DesRoches. Is that how I say his last name?
Yes.
Okay. Who's also a professor at Rice.
He is. He's the provost. He's a professor of engineering, civil engineering. His specialty are earthquakes and structures.
I wanted to get, I forgot about that. That was interesting because he was talking about the condo in Florida that fell down. And he said, hey, there's no way that this thing just fell. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. David Lebron, who was president for 18 years, did he talk about why he decided to be done? Because I feel like I didn't get the answer.
The average tenure for a university president is 8 years. So he's more than twice that.
I didn't know that.
And these jobs are not for everybody, and they're exhausting.
I'm sure.
He has 200 events in his house every year, in his home, in his personal home.
I went to one.
And that's in 9 months. So, what kind of life would you like to lead like that for nonstop? It's a very visible job. Yeah. And that's why most people don't last more than a decade. It's amazing that he worked at a very high level for 18 years.
Yeah, and especially in the past year, I can't even imagine. I'm going to get to your experience here soon. I can't even imagine what it would have been like. And also, I remember he was under a ton of fire, and just because being a student, this was something that I paid attention to. Something like the Willie statue, where, students upon students are calling to take it down. And, we see that a lot in the country right now. And him, you have to juggle the students, and you have to juggle money and investors and that kind of thing. And I'm sure something like that would just be a boatload of stress. So your position, Chair of Crisis Management, what did that look like in this past year?
In many ways, I've been doing crisis things for several decades. And in many ways, it was the most challenging time of my professional life. Mm-hmm. You don't know what to do, right? It's a novel situation where many of the facts are unknown. And so how do you operate when the facts are unknown? Right. So it's been a very challenging 18 months for us.
What do you think what would you say was the thing that really maybe struck you the most, had the most impact on you, or made you think the hardest in this position?
There's nothing that stands out, right? It's so complex. I get asked a lot, what metrics do you look at? What's the trigger for deciding to go remote or for sending students home? And we don't have single metrics like that. It's too complex. Mm-hmm. And so it's the integration of all of those. You're competing you're trying to balance many competing demands to come up with the right set of solutions. So it's really complex.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, being in this position, and, Rice being a major university, do you have guidance or communication with, say, the NIH or, say, Department of Health or the CDC? What does that look like?
Yeah. So we're fortunate that we are right across the street from the biggest and one of the best medical centers in the world. We have long-standing relationships with them. Mm-hmm. One of them is for advice, and so we got a lot of advice from our partners across the street.
Who can you just name one or
our major partners are the Baylor College of Medicine, MD Anderson, Methodist Hospital, Texas Children's Hospital, and UT Health.
Okay.
Those are our 5 major partners. And then universities all share a lot. Like in most industries, you don't share with your competitors. Mm-hmm. We all share information and data about what we're doing. And so I have regular conversations with my peers at other universities around the country. Mm-hmm. What kinds of sampling strategies are you using for testing? What kind of student policies are you having? And so we have a lot of rich set of information there. And then early on in the pandemic, one of the good principles about a crisis is, and especially if you think it's going to last for a while, is to have a set of principles by which you guide all of your decisions. And so we laid out 4 principles right at the very beginning of this. And because it was a novel situation, we said we had to have base many of our decisions on some kind of credible scientific. And so one of our 4 principles was we're going to follow the guidance of the CDC, which generally turned out to be good. They weren't always right, but more often than not, they were.
Yeah. It's definitely, when you just kind of look at everything, listen to all different people. We've had, especially on this podcast, we've had a lot of different people on. We've had one of the earliest doctors who's very famous in Houston, Joseph Ferrone, who started this treatment, and he used hydroxychloroquine. Mm-hmm. And he was on the news. He was on CNN. He was on BBC. He was on the Houston Chronicle talking about it. And we were like, we hear 2 different things. Let's get him on the podcast. Let's have him talk about it. Kind of effective. Not the most effective thing, whatever. We see everything getting politicized more than it should be. And then, especially in the larger institutions, sometimes I feel like the information can get a little, ambiguous because of all the political strife, per se. Did you experience any of that yet in your position?
A little bit. We had the first case in Houston back at the end of February of 2020. COVID case in Houston. Okay. And so that brought a lot of attention, a lot of political attention from public health officials, from the mayor, from the county judge, about what we were going to say, how we were going to portray it, what actions we were going to take. And then, almost every crisis is what I would call socially constructed. We experience them in these medical emergencies that come out of nowhere, and we look for these technical solutions to them. But how we respond to them actually creates a crisis, creates a pandemic.
Yeah.
Think about the questions. Who gets to define a pandemic?
Right.
What is a pandemic? Mm-hmm. Things you would think what constitutes a positive test for COVID? Mm-hmm. It's not binary, it turns out. It is for a test, but there's a range of values of your viral load, and then there's some number that's set that says, okay, you're positive on one side of that, and negative on the other side.
Right.
Speaking of that, seeing as, and I'm sure you're aware, as of this month or probably early next month, the previous protocol for testing is discontinued by the CDC. And they're going to have a new standard protocol that currently the Melinda Gates Foundation is developing. And I'm hearing that they will be administering these protocol systems for about $200 each for 2 hospitals or something in that regard. And that may be the retail price. The exact details aren't set. But in light of that fact, what do we do with all of the testing we did before? Are we going to scrap or alter that data or reinvestigate? Or because, as you said, it's a multi-vector process to do testing. So what's going to happen to the historical data? Do you have any comments on that at all?
It's been it was hard to get testing in the early days. We were lucky we had these relationships with the medical center I described. It was very important for us at the beginning of this to have multiple testing providers and different technologies. And so we've been using 3 different providers and 3 different technologies. Why? If we had a supply chain issue, one of them shut down for some reason, then we had 2 others in backup. We also wanted different technologies that were being used so that if we had, for example, we had a series of cases that people were labeling as false positives early this semester, but they weren't false positives. It was a more sensitive test that was put in that was detecting the tiniest levels of virus, but people actually weren't getting sick or really weren't infected. We could revalidate those tests using a different test and a different provider. So having a multiplicity of tests, and so I would never want to rely only on one testing methodology.
So Kevin, in your bio, you've had a number of experiences working in technology departments with the Army. Low temperature materials is one of them. Now, to me, that's pretty ambiguous. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like it might be fascinating.
It's related to one of your earlier questions.
Okay.
When I was in college, I had a very significant research experience. It's more common now than when I was in college, and I thought, I want to go do basic research. And so my first job out of college was doing basic research on the very low temperature behavior materials. So 60, 70 degrees below freezing. Mm-hmm. Materials work fine. People don't work so well at that temperature. Mm-hmm. But I didn't like it. And I didn't know why I didn't like it. The research was interesting, but I didn't know why I didn't like it. It just felt like this wasn't the right thing for me. So it's hard to be really good at something that you don't really like. But I didn't know why. And I didn't really know why for another decade or so. It's because when you are doing basic research, you get up and you say, I have one thing I'm interested in. It's my basic research question. I spend all day thinking about it, and then I go to bed thinking about it, and I get up the next day and do the same thing. In my day, I need a lot of variety. But I didn't know that when I was 20 years old. Mm. But I was influenced by this research experience I had as an undergrad. And so it wasn't until I got into my 30s that I realized I needed lots of variety in my life. Like if you look at what I did today, I had 10 different meetings on 10 different subjects today. That's what I'm like. That's what I do every day. Right? It's a general management role. Mm-hmm. And so that's more suited to me. I wish I had known that earlier in my life.
Oh, what, you worked at the White House or with the White House? Actually at the White House?
Yes.
You worked with the Army. It seems like you're definitely getting into very serious things. Could you maybe talk to us about something interesting, is there anything you can't tell us?
Of course there is.
Okay,
a lot of the work I
did
was classified a long time ago. So,
do we have aliens? Are they here?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know of. We, I think I mentioned this to you. We had another professor from Rice, Dr. James Torr. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you...
I know Jim, yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Mm-hmm. also working on very interesting things, also contracted by the military. I don't know the details, maybe nothing crazy, but you also worked at the NIH.
Yeah.
And did you actually work with somebody like Anthony Fauci? Were you
I did.
connected to him?
Yeah. There were, it was the 90s. And
important time back then.
There were three important things. So what I tell the students at Rice is that when you're thinking about a job, there are three important things. Is it the right place, the right role, and the right time? Right? And most people don't think about the last one because all organizations cycle. And sometimes it's more interesting to be in a place than others. And so when I was there, Harold Varmus had just come in to be the director of NIH. He was probably the most successful person in its 100-year history. And he brought in a lot of really extraordinary people. Tony Fauci was already there, Francis Collins, led the Human Genome Project, who's the current director. But what was happening was, it was the magical combination of three things, which made it the right time to be there. So one was, when the NIH budget doubled, right? And they provide approaching half of all the research funding that the federal government provides. So it's a huge amount of money. Two was, there was a lot of smart people there. And three, really in the beginning of the 90s was when it was the sort of the unfolding of the opportunities in the biomedical world. And so it was a chance to do good in a way that wasn't really previously possible. So for example, when I worked in the Institute to do research on the brain, and the person who I worked for, when he was hired, he was right out of Harvard Medical School, and they said, well, should I go into research or should I go into clinical care? And they said, well, if you hope to treat, prevent, or cure people through clinical work, we don't know enough about the brain, so we're not able to. But if you want an interesting research career, you should go into research, and that's what he did. And so in the 90s, the human genome was deciphered, so more genes were expressed in the brain than anywhere else. Functional MRI was developed so you could see inside the brain in real time if you were, say, fearful or happy, what kinds of processes were going on inside the brain. And so all of a sudden you had this great opportunity to do really amazing things. So you combine really smart people, a lot of money, and opportunity, and it's a magical time.
I believe that, and I feel like especially back then would have made sense because there was a lot going on, like you said. Are you familiar with Eric Weinstein?
No.
Eric Weinstein is a mathematician, brother of Brett Weinstein. The reason I asked is because they went to MIT, just wasn't sure if there'd be any crossover. But I was listening to a discussion with Eric Weinstein, and he was talking about Anthony Fauci, and he was talking about leadership. And obviously, we all know that Anthony's position is impeccably hard. We can't even imagine it. But something that Eric said that resonated with me is that we have in these large institutions a lot of careerists. And I would assume, or I would not assume, I would say Anthony Fauci kind of feels like that at this point. And Eric was saying that he carries a lot of baggage with him for various reasons. And maybe in this time period, that would not be the best move, because we're talking about political trust, just general career baggage, etc. Do you think that that claim makes sense? Do you understand where he's coming from with that?
I do. I think it's mixed. Tony Fauci's been at NIH forever. Had many opportunities to be the director of NIH and was not interested. Oh. And I think you need a mix of people like him, like Francis Collins, who's been there for a long time, with people who come in for short periods of time. So right. Harold Varmus, when he came in, he said, look, I don't know how successful I'm going to be, but he goes, I'm going to leave after 6 or 7 years. Why? Because even if I'm completely successful, I need people with different perspectives and a fresh view who might emphasize different areas. And he did. He left after 6 or 7 years. And so it's important to have both.
Yeah. I feel like I completely agree with that. And maybe even Eric, and I keep referring to him because I just sympathize with his views, and I essentially hold the same position. says that maybe, we need somebody who has a different perspective, maybe who's younger, who hasn't had necessarily a bunch of negative experiences, but is still, very smart. And I was just listening to Francis Collins the other day on a guy named Lex Friedman's podcast, who also graduated from MIT. And it just seems like sometimes the public can lose trust because they're not, these leaders, Tony Fauci, Francis Collins a little bit as well, aren't adhering to some of the qualities that you mentioned at the very beginning about leaders. For example, when Tony Fauci very early on in the pandemic said, do not buy masks, adamant, as well as the Surgeon General, Jerome, they were adamant about it. And then they later came back and said, well, that was because of our supply. To me, I understand that 100%. If we have a low supply on masks and the healthcare workers need it, I'm all for that. And let's not buy the mask. But I would recommend not lying just blankly. And so I feel like that's another thing that creates a little bit of strife in the United States, or it creates this distrust. And I wonder, what do you think about that? Why do you think maybe he wouldn't have just come and said, hey, I messed up, or hey, we just need them for the workers, rather than just giving us a straight answer that wasn't exactly true?
I don't find Tony Fauci to be deceptive at all, or not telling the truth. In fact, he's reversed his opinion about things publicly many times because there is much that we don't know. And early in the pandemic, there was certainly a concern about supplies of certain things like masks. But we also didn't know what we know today. So at Rice, we have a huge supply of wipes, right? To clean everything down. And we were wiping down surfaces and fogging bathrooms and doing all kinds of things. It turns out that stuff is marginally helpful. What's really important is stopping aerosol transmission. We didn't know that 18 months ago, and we know it now. And so much of our mitigation efforts are going towards wearing masks or modifying the environment inside buildings with higher efficiency filters, UV lights, increasing airflow through buildings. And so much of the emphasis of mitigation, we know so much more than back 18 months ago.
I absolutely agree with that. I just felt like that was one example where that wasn't so much about knowing this, how COVID works or something, but more just, it just seemed like something that wasn't necessarily meant to be that way. And one thing that I thought was very interesting is I was looking at the numbers for Rice University regarding COVID cases, testing, blah, 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 blah. It's primarily, the highest levels are in the staff, separate from faculty and students, regarding number of cases. Why do you think that is?
Oh, when you look at any data, you want to understand the context in which you live in. And Houston and Harris County have had very high levels. We also know a lot more about our community because we test, as a coherent community, we test a lot more than anybody else, which has allowed us to take faster action. Up until this semester, we had about 550 cases at the beginning, up through the beginning of this semester. About half a dozen of them were for on-campus transmission. So this wasn't happening in classrooms or in the rec center or between students. It was mostly happening in people's homes, right? Or they go out to the grocery store, that have a relative. And that's where most of the infections were coming through vectors from off campus. And our students were, incredibly careful. Wore masks all the time. 97% of them are vaccinated. And when we look at our employee base, it's about 90% vaccinated. So our students are actually being much more careful and doing all the public health things that we would want them to do.
Yeah, I'm sure it's definitely, and I know the staff, that really means like janitors, food people. right?
Well, we have about 3,500 staff. I'm staff.
Just on
people in public affairs.
The reason I say staff like that is because on the graphs it's separated faculty. Mm-hmm. So you would be staff, but then teachers would be faculty, professors would be faculty. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. So we've got about 3,000 or so staff, and we've got about 700 or 800 faculty.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me.
So you ought to expect to see a higher percentage of staff because there's more of them.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, you touched on it. Let's do the hot button issue. Mm-hmm. Does Rice, I'm not sure if they currently do or what they will do. Are they going to, or do they mandate that all the students receive the vaccine, and faculty and staff?
Yeah, we talked a lot about that. And as best we can tell, the people who've disclosed that they've been vaccinated, we're approaching the mid-90s from our total population. We have a total population on a given day of about 12,000 people. 93, 94, 95% of them are vaccinated. So a certain percentage of the other 5, 6, 7%, they're going to have other medical reasons. They can't be religious exemptions. So if we had a mandate, how much better would we make the environment?
Right.
Now, if we were like SMU, I think 70% of their students are vaccinated. Mm-hmm. That's a completely different scenario. If you're the University of Alabama, right, with a much lower vaccination rate, then you'd really start to consider measures like vaccine mandates. But we don't have to.
Yeah, and I think that is, respectable. When we spoke with Dr. Torr, James Torr, he said to us, and I thought this was surprising because it didn't necessarily follow the traditional opinion. He said, hey, and you know how he's intense, which is fun to be around. He said, I got it. If it does what it's supposed to do, it's protecting me from you. And then, hopefully I don't get it and don't spread it. And I thought, okay, that's a good point. And also, he's a very religious guy. I don't know if you know that or not.
I do.
And so I know that plays a part in it for him as well. But I appreciated this sort of, in this context, this is a specific context. I can't say this for every other disease or every other thing. It is dicey territory, especially when it comes to the federal workers having everybody being vaccinated or making people lose their jobs in that way. And I think it's good to respect the people. And if it is 95%, then I guess you don't have to do anything.
If you go back to what we were talking about earlier about leaders and leadership, and, one of my hopes early on in the pandemic actually hasn't come to pass, but, there's less care for the commons now. It's a general statement about our society. It's more about individualism and me.
It is.
And I was hoping that the pandemic would help us reset that a bit, right? Wearing a mask is an act of reciprocity, right? It's not just protecting me, I'm protecting you from me, right? Getting a vaccine isn't just about protecting myself, it's about protecting me from other people too, right? So it's an act of reciprocity that I had hoped more people would do because they care for the commons, right? They care for all of us, not just for me.
Yeah. We had a really nice guest on 2 weeks ago. And one thing that I think our society and also our public health institutions, what they're missing out on is the call towards health, call towards actual natural health. Mm-hmm. So the woman that we had on 2 weeks ago is a plant-based food activist, but, just about health in general. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about when she got sick, vitamins C, D, and we've learned that especially for COVID, vitamin D is one of the most important things that you can get. And people get vitamin D in different ways. And those who are hospitalized for COVID, 94% had one of the major comorbidities. And a lot of times that's either obesity, lack of vitamins, or diabetes is one of them. So one thing that Armin and I have tried to do on the podcast with some of our doctor friends is talk about just a call towards good health. And thankfully at the Rice Serveries, it's pretty good. I always had a lot of great options there.
When I was at the National Institutes of Health, there were many complementary and alternative medicines that were being used throughout the United States. The medical community is generally hostile to those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And but we created during that time a new institute there because people were going to use them regardless of what the medical profession said. What we needed was good research on St. John's wort or certain vitamins or things like that. Mm-hmm. And so that led to the creation and the funding of a significant effort to study these complementary and alternative medicines so that we have evidence that either they work or they don't work.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people take them and they believe in them. So you at least like to understand that
When
better.
you say alternative medicines, you're referring to vitamin D?
I'm referring to all alternative things, right?
Alternative things. Would you say that intravenous concentrates like vitamin D, zinc, Z-stacks of various sorts are pretty much, they're probably the most established medical chemical treatments that we have in our current system?
I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to speculate, but
yeah,
it depends on your condition, how much you take. So we just need a lot more evidence about those kinds of things than we have.
One thing that we do know is that, or that I like to say as a vegan person, as a plant-based person, is that just for good overall health for all people, a plant-based diet, because of its least inflammatory ability, is one of the best things that you can do right now to stay healthy. And, if you do get sick, well, then you got to work on that. But I want to respect your time because I think it's time to go. And for everybody who's joined us today, we want to thank Kevin Kirby for coming on the podcast, having a great conversation with us. There's a lot of really interesting things that I think we discussed. And, make sure to look them up. Look up, see what Rice is doing. Rice is really one of the greatest institutions, I would say, in Houston as well as in the South. So, Kevin, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Jen.
Well, this will be up soon, and we'll see everybody soon.